of interviews with Foucauldians. Today I am here with Andrea Pitts. Thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here.
So if you don't mind just saying a little bit about who you are, what your interests are, and your affiliation.
Okay, I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I've been here now, this is my 6th year at UNC Charlotte. I work primarily in critical philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, and Latinx and Latin American philosophy. So those have been the kind of 3 main areas that I focused on since during graduate school and afterwards. Yeah, I've been publishing in those areas. I also have some work in trans studies, transgender philosophy, and also critical prison studies, which overlaps with those other research areas in a few ways. So those are kind of like the big general categories.
Great. And as you know, in this series of videos, I'm talking primarily to people about Foucault, but the discussion has gone in a number of ways so far. And so let me begin by asking you simply what role Foucault has played in your intellectual development and how you have used Foucault to think about the questions that you're posing philosophically. So what's your relationship to Foucault?
I mean, I guess I could tell a story about reading Foucault because I have read Foucault. I mean, we talked about this before, but I don't consider myself a Foucauldian proper, as I'm not, as a figure, he's not someone who I've kind of delved into his archive and corpus and really kind of spent what I see as like the kind of really careful figure-oriented work on his writings. Although I do have figures like Gloria Anzaldúa or Franz Fanon that are, I think, more closer to that kind of figure relationship in my own writings and thinking. But I did read him early on in graduate school. So the first text that I read by Foucault was The Birth of the Clinic. And I read it in a course on medicalization in the body. And I think that was a really eye-opening experience for me. And we can talk about that more later. But I think I'm also, so I've read that. I've read Discipline and Punish. I've read The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Those were all things that I read when I was working on my master's in Tampa, Florida. And I was reading them with folks who also probably don't identify as Foucauldians, but who find something very useful in the way that he approaches the history of ideas, that he approaches power, the way that he approaches relations between self-identification and the body. I mean, all those things. I think a lot of those themes are things that I've found very interesting, not only in his writings, but also in other figures. So those are kind of themes that I've really tried to dig on for a really long time, and he happens to be one of the people who not only wrote about those in relatively recent history philosophically, but also someone who has a political stake in addressing kind of systemic harm and violence. And I think that's also something that in my own writing and thinking and life have been like at the foreground. And so I think his work has been pivotal in those ways because he's kind of tried, from what I've know and read, and the people who I read who are influenced by him, that he's really attentive to the ways in which institutions and kind of networks of either different industries or technologies or ways of presenting oneself or speaking or inhabiting the world can then have some kind of shared structures and linkages that then end up impacting how we understand ourselves or how we're able to communicate what our experiences are, or all these other layers. So I think, like, at the very least, I've been consistently interested in how we are shaped by systems of power and yet are able to find ways to speak back. And so his work is also one of those, I think, kind of cool set of, like, he offers a cool set of resources for thinking about how that happens.
And I mean, one of the themes that's become very clear from these interviews is just how useful Foucault has turned out to be for people who don't identify necessarily as Foucault scholars. People like you, or people even like me, who have an interest in some of the things that Foucault does, but maybe we are not entirely devoted to him as our primary object of study. And so it seems like you came to him, as a master's student, and so that will be that's an interesting overlap since my students are master's students who are reading Foucault for the first time. And so I want to ask you about the next step then in your intellectual formation. So you were exposed to Foucault in your master's program. You wrote a master's thesis, then you went on to pursue a PhD. What did you end up writing about for your dissertation?
Well, just a quick note, I didn't write a thesis, actually.
Okay.
We had a comprehensive exam system where I was, and then I transferred actually as a master's student after having worked some years and getting specialization also in Latin American and Caribbean studies. So I started pursuing that while I was still a master's student. And then I went to a different PhD granting institution and wrote my dissertation. So there was like a lag in there between, what the thesis, like that thesis timeline and the dissertation. One of the things that I actually wrote my comp exams on, though, was feminist epistemology and philosophy of science. And so I think that, and I know your work as well certainly deals with the history of science and technology. And so like thinking about the kind of, I think early on I had this relationship and fascination with the way that Foucault described certain medical technologies and their relationship to the body and the vulnerability or exposure of the body, or people's kind of intimate, like their concerns about intimacy within the clinical setting. I thought that was a really rich and exciting conversation in the birth of the clinic. And specifically that note about the stethoscope and like why that was developed, because of the kind of like, moral norms about, male masculine identified cisgender physicians. I mean, those weren't the terms at the time, but men who were physicians being too close to a woman's chest. And so that there was like these moral and sexual norms about intimacy that were then needing to be preserved through a technology, which I thought was mind-blowing at the time, because it also reframed what were taken as very instrumental objects and then put them in this vast history of human relations that I thought was amazing. So in any case, that interlude in feminist philosophy of science and the work that I was doing in feminist epistemology was part of that kind of like, there was a growth of interest about those topics and interests. And because I was also studying Latin American and Caribbean history and cultural studies at the time, there's so many, I think, also wonderful and interesting work by not only Foucauldian historians and cultural studies theorists like Ann Stoler, for example, who were looking at colonial relations of intimacy and colonial techniques of control and regulation of kinship networks and property and the domestic sphere and all these things that I was kind of also in that milieu when I was in my master's program. So that kind of emphasis on colonial intimacy and the emphasis on intimacy in the clinical setting were like really formative, I think, for what I ended up, I think, going on to do when I went to the PhD. Yeah.
And I mean, Foucault is certainly, I think, at his best when he does these sort of, I'll just call them microhistories, for example, of particular events or objects or techniques that are very visual and very specific, like the stethoscope, or his analysis of the panopticon, very famous, where he takes a practice that we sort of tend to gloss over in terms of just how packed with meaning it is, and the extent to which it reflects a whole set of historical norms in its very embodiment. And I mean, the connection, of course, to the history of science is there just in terms of Foucault's own training, coming out of a tradition of French. His teachers were historians of science primarily. And you've written about both of those subjects, right? You've written about feminist epistemology and philosophy of science, and you've also written about the clinic, or about medicine just more broadly. And so I want to make sure that we return to that, because I read your paper on Fanon and colonialism and the clinical encounter, and I think my students would benefit from maybe talking a little bit about about colonialism in medicine, especially from
Yeah.
from a non-Foucauldian perspective, which is the perspective that you present with Fanon. But so let me just return to then you went on to, you transferred to finish to do your PhD somewhere else after having been exposed to Latin American or philosophy of the Americas, Latin American thought and Caribbean
Mm-hmm.
thought.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you end up working on for your doctoral dissertation then?
So I ended up actually, I ended up, I had toyed with the idea of writing on a set of issues within Latin American philosophy, because when I was in my master's institution, I was also working with a really amazing Latin American feminist philosopher, Ofelia Schutte, who, if your students right now are thinking about neoliberalism, her work has been, I think, really fantastic in thinking about how neoliberal policies have shaped Latin American cultural studies and culture more generally. So she's got a really great book on that. So I was working with her. I transferred, started working my PhD, and it actually became, I had toyed with the idea of working in Latin American philosophy, but then I had also been working with my dissertation advisor, who is Jose Medina, who he's a Wittgensteinian by training, and so he's very much immersed in this view about I mean, there's a kind of an anti-philosophy thing going on where there's like this critique of the type of all-encompassing systematicity of, like, you know, figuring out your ethics and your political philosophy, and like that it all had to somehow cohere in a neat package. So he was kind of very interested in you know, being quite contextual about how one proposes their projects, about considering the social dynamics of whatever context you're exploring. So and also being pluralist about social context. I think that was also something that working with Jose had been, I think, thing that started shaping my thinking in the PhD program. I also started taking classes on like pragmatism and what's called like neo-pragmatism. And so like these like trajectories of thinking, which are also, I think, interestingly connected to this very point that we just talked about a minute ago about objects and instrumentalization, because, you know, the kind of like, you know, maybe general view about pragmatism and maybe classical US based pragmatism is that, you know, that it's about what works, about what's instrumentally useful and so on. But I think that view is kind of a really narrow and general framing of pragmatism. And so I think the way that some pragmatist thinkers, and I don't also endorse, like, wouldn't call myself a pragmatist, but I do think that some of the criticisms that pragmatists have made about foundationalisms in philosophy, so about like what have to be the conditions of existence for the world, or what have to be the things that we know in some very primary sense that kind of frame all of our thinking, are actually rife for critique, and they're potential obstacles to how we can problem solve and how we can address specifically social and political problems. And so, like, I think that actually coheres really well with the kind of contextualism that I was mentioning, and then also the like early thinking about like the early kind of training and thinking through Foucault and colonial studies, because it's also that you have to have some, you know, if you maintain a certain set of presumptions, either background historical presumptions, or you have a certain set of, you know, like foundational beliefs that are then going to scaffold and serve as the method for doing all of the work that you're trying to take up, you may end up really narrowing or limiting your scope of analysis. And so I think like there's a bit of not just pluralism, but also a kind of like experimentalism about how to do philosophy and about how to you know, explore a problem that I think is really important. So I started doing that. So and then I haven't said anything about what the dissertation is about.
Yeah. It's okay. It can take a while till we get there, but just to plug in one quick thought here. Foucault himself has been read as a pragmatist by a number of people precisely for these reasons, right? There is the anti-foundationalism. There is the unyielding historicism, in which everything has to be thought of in terms of its historical embeddedness. And there's also just this attention, just thinking about the term pragmatism, to material practices, right?
Yeah,
To the way in
absolutely.
which things work on the ground. And in some of his works, Foucault talks about this in terms of the distinction between a theory of X and an analytics, where analytics is about getting down on the ground and like seeing the way things actually work without beginning from these a priori philosophical assumptions about either the way the world is or the way it must be, so that human reason is somehow at home in it.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and so you then had this training in pragmatism, or an interest in pragmatism, and so it culminated in dot dot
In
dot.
yeah, in the dissertation project, which was on the title was on racial interpellation and second personhood, understanding the normative dynamics of race talk. And so at that point, I had really been thinking a lot about language and about how language impacts the ways that how language is a form of action. So maybe this is in line with the kind of anti-foundationalisms as well, is that like the idea that language is somehow structuring all of what we know, or that it's a grounding for our commitments to one another or something like that, is only a partial view. Like, yes, language plays a role in how we're able to express ourselves, how we connect to one another intimately, what the meaning of our experience can be, right? Like, clearly that's something that language serves a function, or many functions, let's say. But then there's also this side, maybe this is back to the materiality point, is that like language is also something that our bodies do, right? It's something that we do interactively with one another. And I know for me, how I focused on what I called race talk, but really how it is that language shapes racial identification, and I think racial disidentification. I didn't use the language of disidentification at the time, but I certainly thought about that in terms of like how whiteness becomes something that can be solidified and protected over time. And again, I'm thinking through to the colonial histories too that I was thinking about. So like, what is
Yes.
it that allowed a certain kind of colonial elite, or even a mestizo elite in a given context, to disidentify, or to shape and reframe relations to indigenous others, or Afro-descendant others, or class differential, lower class others, and so on, so that there was this kind of like that language was one of those pieces, right? We know it not only codified through law, but we know it also through how people understood and spoke and continued to speak about, in derogatory ways about racialized, marginally, like, racialized others, so to say. And so I think for me, that was a really exciting set of questions and comments. And so, and commentary that had been, I think, connecting a bunch of other themes. And so the project was on the normative dynamics of race,
Of
basically, of
race
race
and
talk.
language.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's great. And Foucault is he's famous for making this claim that we need to move away from the monarchical conception of power, in which power and normativity is expressed through a sort of top-down cascade model. And then he says, no, it actually happens through all these social practices. And it seems like you're saying language is one of them, in line with a number of philosophers of language
Yeah.
and theorists of language. And for however much I like Foucault, I actually don't think he's very good on the question of language.
Mm-hmm.
On the question of language, the two thinkers that you mentioned earlier, Gloria Anzaldúa and Fanon, are just significantly much more sophisticated and much more piercing in their thinking. So maybe we can transition to that
Yeah,
and leave Foucault a little bit behind,
sure.
because as soon as you talked about racial disidentification and identification, it just brought to mind that very powerful passage that was very influential for me when I first read Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, where he talks about the politics of language of the
Mm-hmm.
Black Martinican, the colonized Black subject, who goes to France
Mm-hmm.
and tries so hard, and speaking French as a first language, tries so hard to conceal their accent, their Caribbean accent, and just the way in which they get coded systematically as Caribbean by the way in which they misrolled the R's according to the norms of continental French people. And then when he says when the Black subject comes back to Martinique and gets off the boat, his language suddenly becomes an object of surveillance by other Black subjects, because it's this implicit understanding that a lot of psychic identification and disidentification at the level of race and identity then has effects, or at least gets picked up in terms of language. So it just made me think about this.
Yeah, no, I think Black Skin, White Masks was one of the core texts that I used in the dissertation, because it was Fanon's, I mean, as you just wonderfully expressed, like his attentiveness to the both, like, I mean, it's a kind of creative set of relations in both positive and negative ways, right? So creative of forms of anxiety and fear and relations of presumed, needing to be ashamed of oneself, and then also these capacities for, and I think what's interesting in Black Skin, White Mask is also the capacity to speak back against those narratives of shame and fear, which is also, which he complicates in a number of ways, right? So he discusses the negritude movement and the kind of poetic projects among Aimé Césaire and other Afro-Caribbean writers who were themselves traveling to Paris and to other places and having a kind of, building new communities among Afro-diasporic peoples in Europe, for example. And so I think like he complicates what it means to actually speak like in as a collective as well, and how hard that is, and what the kind of traps and tropes are of being assuming oneself to be transparent to others, or assuming oneself to be politically, even righteous to the extent that one would want to be. So I think he kind of like gives these really a masterful set of resources and texts on how hard that is, and I think so actually one of the things that I really focused on the dissertation was organized with like 2 theory chapters at the beginning that was on meta-ethics and neo-pragmatism and language. And then the last 3 chapters were kind of looking at different framings of, I mentioned the word interpellation, and that has a long, rich history as well. I mean, the Marxist Louis Althusser.
Can you define that for our students who are not familiar with that term?
Yeah. So like I'm just gonna go the broader writings on to interpellate can be thought of as like to call or to hail, and there's other French connotations that are relevant, but not specifically for the project that I was up to. So, but my understanding of it was that there's this kind of Marxist tradition stemming from people might consider a neo-Marxist writer, Louis Althusser, who was in a sense trying to understand a series of problems within Marxism about writing, about the transparency of language. I mean, a lot of these things too will connect to the Foucauldian problems of authorship and so on, but about also the ability for text itself to say what it thinks it's saying, or to be, let's say, for text itself to be foundational for building knowledge. And I think that one of the things that Althusser gives this famous example is that, there are these hails, that we hail one another, that there's this kind of implicit call to one another through language, and that when we do this, it sets up not just that we know things, like we have certain beliefs that we form, but that it also requires us to act and become things. And I think that's a really interesting point, because the famous example is that the police officer says, "Hey, you there," to someone in the street, and that that just the call the officers, yelling leads someone to turn around and feel like, was that me, right? The kind of guilt and potential directedness of that call is actually doing something to me. It's not simply just like, oh, now I know, there is a person who is calling me, but that it creates a fear in me, or it creates a reluctance in me. And I might say, well, I'm not turning around. It couldn't be talking to me, but whatever it's doing, it's actually changing me, and it's changing our environment, and it's changing our relationships. And so I took that insight from Althusser and about the kind of like formative and maybe potentially transformative capacity of linguistic interaction to then understand how that works with racial identification and transformation. And so the last 3 chapters are these like kind of 3 like valences of what I was calling racial interpellation, these types of hails and calls to one another.
Were they examples and case studies of what racial interpellation looks like on your reading? Okay.
Can you they were 3. Yeah. So there was one, and they happen in different valences. So like when we hail one another third personally, as like that person over there, right? So there was that kind of hail to say like them over there, they are like this, and so it's that kind of third personal hail to talk about someone in the third person, to reference them as a them. And then there's this one chapter is on the second person, which is to hail someone as a you, to say, hey, you there, right? Which is like the Althusserian example. But if I said, hey, David, do you want to do something, right? So I'm hailing you second personally. Letters are also very famous in this way, that you write a letter usually to another person in the second person, right? So that, you may be reading this, but, and so on. And then the last chapter was on the first personal, and what it meant is what it means to hail ourselves as an I, and what it means to write oneself. And I used writing as the example, and so I used autobiography as the way of hailing oneself. And in each of those cases, I looked at examples of what I saw as racial interpellation in the third, the second, and the first case. And so the third, and I could, do you want me to just thread through those chapters, or should I pause?
No, give us a couple of examples of just what these interpellations might look like concretely. Because my mind just starts running with examples, even just from my own personal experience, of ways in which you can be sort of frozen in moment almost, depending on the kind of interpellation that you're subjected to. But I want to hear about the examples that come to your mind about it.
So I looked at, each chapter had a focus on a different case. So the third person example was looking at the Tucson Unified School District in Arizona was placing, this is around like 2011 or so, was banning Mexican American studies programs in the high school curriculum. And so what I looked in that case was like, how were Mexican Americans being described in the legislation that was being produced at that time? And so that's the third person hail of being that group there, those teachers who are teaching about Mexican American history, those Mexican American students, those, and I mean, any third personal example can work, and you can work through plenty of examples in this way. But I chose that one because it's quite explicit what the concerns were, and they actually mirror things we're hearing today from this administration in terms of the fear of creating resentment among white and non-white racial groups, for example, or like the fear of being un-American. And so that I was looking at how there's these implicit hails to transform the populace, in this case a school district and youth, to either view their ethnic and racial identities as being unneeded for understanding their civic role in society, or being something that should be private. And so there was a kind of private-public distinction that circulated a lot at that time. Also, as being threatening. So understanding that like Mexican American culture was being coded and messaged in that legislation as threatening to civic order. And those are some of the ways that there was these like transformative implicit hails in the third person. So that was the third personal case. The second personal case is when I was actually working through a clinical medical context. And it was about the patient-provider relationship, which is
Okay,
something
great.
that I've continued to write on elsewhere, because that's one of
Yes.
these, again, like going back to the roots of this, these very intimate conversations, right? Like people tell doctors things that they may not tell anyone else, or medical providers, and they tell medical providers things in a setting that makes oneself extremely vulnerable. And so what I looked at in that case was actually a layer of translation between providers who were listening to patient testimony or patient symptomatologies, and who were, potentially like shaping not just the treatment that they would offer, but which things could show up as problems in the clinical setting. And so like, the examples were like, if you're thinking about, say, medical providers who are English only speakers and Spanish speakers who require interpretation in the clinical setting. And so there's really interesting work on like in that interaction between these two, well, three, I guess in this case, but between these people, is that there's like subtle suggestions of what counts as something that could properly show up as a symptom or not, or what can properly show up as an expression of pain or not. And those are, again, very racialized framings of what can count as a human experience, and how it is that a physician may hold quite an amount of control with respect to the types of resources that the patient may be able to receive. And so it was kind of looking at those dynamics in the clinical setting.
Yeah, and in your work on colonialism and carceral medicine, you use some really good examples just to add to this. One of them, which has become well known over the last couple of years, is the asymmetrical distribution of pain medicine, where a doctor listening to a white patient and a black patient presenting the same symptoms will overprescribe painkillers to the white patient, but underprescribe them to the black patient. And this is just sort of rife with all these assumptions about the inherent resilience of black bodies. And for instance, I recently read a really troubling study how many modern day, and I'm here talking in the last 3 years, medical students still think that black skin is a little bit thicker than white skin. So these sort of old racial scientific concepts that still shape the way in which a doctor will interact with the second person, a patient, in a clinical setting. And it all happens, of course, at the level of language and perception, but language is an essential part of that.
Yeah.
And just so what registers and what doesn't register as relevant, or oh, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to add that I think that Fanon's writings on medicine and colonialism were pivotal in that context, because he, very famously, like, resigns from the hospital that he's working at because of the way that his, colleagues, his white colleagues, are treating the black and Arab patients that they're treating. Mostly, I think, North African Arab patients in this context. But so he famously resigns because he's seeing this, like, exactly the way, very similar to the way that you're describing it, is these set of, like, kind of background beliefs about how, not just like the corporeal, like, misbeliefs about the patient's body, but also about the patient's motives, which I found very interesting in Fanon's writings, is that he's writing that, like, French doctors who are treating Algerian patients, in this case, Algeria being in, he's starting to now think through, like, what are the politicized terms across institutions for resistance among Algeria's, which is happening in Algeria at the time, but a resistance among Algerians. And so what he's seeing is then that French doctors are starting to distrust the patients that they're seeing in the clinic. And so they not only have all these potential stereotypes about their bodies, or that they have these misleading views about what can count as pain or what can count as a proper symptom. But then there's also these added dimensions of antagonism between this broader political event happening, in which they're both potentially playing a role. And so it really impacts what I started writing on later and what I wrote on at the time about these relations of trust between the provider and patient. Because of course, like ideally people think, oh, the reason why I can be vulnerable with my doctor is because I trust that that doctor will, you know, hold my information confidentially, will want to preserve my best interests, right? Want to the kind of do no harm principles and all those things. But that ideal is actually quite skewed, because what it doesn't take into consideration are all of these other ways in which our relationships of trust and intimacy are already being formed by the worlds that we're living in, right? They're already being shaped by our preconceptions and our own you know, like material interactions with one another. So I think that to me, that second personal piece and then the clinical setting was something that I continued working on.
Yeah, and just thinking about this in terms of what is beyond just the clinical setting, properly considered and sort of demarcated as a room with the doctor and the patient. Thinking about the broader setting. And one thing that really made this connect for me from your work is the reference that you make to the ways in which sometimes the logic of medicine and public health and sanitation becomes one of the driving justifications for the colonial project. And so, you know, of course, then there's this rhetoric that precedes the patient-doctor encounter, in which already a colonial power is slowly encroaching upon a new space and justifying that by appealing to the need to bring healthcare or just the concept of health more generally to that population, so that from the very beginning, the colonized subject, and I think you're right that Fanon is sort of focusing on this, experiences medical authority as inseparable from colonial rule, and so it, you know, the intentions of the doctor are the last thing that we need to turn to for thinking about what's structuring this dynamic.
Yeah, and it's also a window into, I think, where like how these things can surface. I also do think, because I've played with that leveling about like, what's relevant in the context of the clinic, and what does it reveal about these, I think, more widespread and more pervasive forms of interpersonal relations. And so I think that's kind of why when I started focusing on correctional medicine, so my later stuff is starting to focus specifically on healthcare in prisons. And I actually, while I was working on the dissertation, I was also working with an activist and a reading group in a prison in Nashville. And so that's actually, there's this group Reach Coalition that I was working with at the time. So I started thinking also concretely about incarceration in medicine during that time as well. But I mean, what's interesting to me is that like sometimes these hyper contextual, what did you call it a minute ago about like the reason when Foucault's at his best is when he does these like microhistories?
Yeah, microhistories,
I
guess.
Okay. Yeah. So like having that kind of like sharp focus actually, I think also sometimes reveals other things that wouldn't be able to be as obvious were they not, you know, kind of already first taken in that light and then expanded outward. And I think the carceral medicine stuff for me starts really focusing on what some people may think is like a subset of medicine, or maybe a strange subfield of medicine that's not as common or is not as big and whatnot. I think is actually much more revealing about clinical medicine in precisely the dimensions that you're describing, about that they are racialized through and through, that there are colonial and kind of capitalist shapings to the ways that they exist. I think actually gets heightened and amplified if you look at this context. And so I think that's kind of the one thing that I started thinking about in the dissertation as well.
Yeah, and just the way in which it crystallizes a power dynamic that sometimes may be a little bit harder to see. And so again, I'll be referencing your work at times just because it's fresh in my mind, but you talk about, for example, the credibility deficits, for example, that prisoners suffer from in their interaction with a doctor, where because the interaction is already shaped by the prison industrial complex, something that's sort of endemic to medicine, that is already part of the logic of medicine, which is this notion that the doctor knows best and that the doctor will, if need be, overrule the experiential authority of the patient. It just sort of happens all the time when you're dealing with a vulnerable population like the incarcerated. Which, you know, Fanon reminds us also happens with the colonized, which from work on social epistemology, we know also happens with the disabled. It happens with women. It happens with queer patients whose testimony just gets given less weight by this listening.
And is shaped by what narrative is demanded in the clinic. I think that's another interesting piece of this too, because like if we want to flag Foucault again, one of the things I also read as a master's student was the Mutilating Gender essay by Dean Spade. And Dean Spade has continued to be a figure who has shaped my thinking about prison abolitionism, about trans politics, about gender, I mean, all kinds of stuff. So, but one of the things that Spade says about the clinical setting is he's talking about trans patients who are seeking gender affirming treatments and resources from clinicians. And he gives his own personal narrative in that essay. I don't know if you know it, but it's a good one. It's a good one. It's a good one. It's in the first Transgender Studies Reader volume, but it's also it's got Foucault and it's got this it's got a critique. It's got Foucault's critique of the repression narrative and that kind of stuff. And so, but basically, what Spade says is that trans people who go into clinical settings and seek gender affirming resources are being forced to fit our own narratives into what's available in the clinical setting. And so like how one kind of can show up to the physician as saying something relevant to them that would then give that person who's requesting resources access to those resources. Like I have to convince them that I'm actually what I say I am, and so it's like this convincing. And I think there's a nice parallel too in Fanon's writings where there's like this attempt to convince, there's this attempt to try to say I can give all of the words that I have, and you still wouldn't be able to all of the words that properly describe my experience, or all of the words that I feel like actually are the closest resonances I can get in language to be able to describe what's happening to me, that then that still may not be enough. And it still may have to be really, reshaped and distorted in order for a clinical and institutional setting to be able to actually properly and legally and, institutionally recognize that there's something that I'm eligible for, or that I'm now, warranted in receiving. And so like the example that I think is from Fanon that's really amazing, I really love this passage, it's in his one of his second major works, A Dying Colonialism, is he talks about that the physician quits listening to the symptoms of the patient. Like at some point, so he's seeing a North African patient, and the physician just quits, turns off the dialogue, says the verbal communication is no longer relevant. And the thing that will actually make their determination is the eloquence of the colonized person's body. So it's their body that will somehow speak more clearly, just the physical now objecthood of the body, whatever, and this again, if you're thinking about Foucault, the lesions, the infections, whatever kinds of, things that the doctor themselves can find on the body are going to be more truthful and more telling about what's actually happening than what it is that the patient themselves could say. And I think that's I understand why that's framed that way, but I also find it extremely unsettling that that's actually, how the kind of clinical encounters are shaped, because I think there's more and more ways in which not just lack of engagement with narratives from patients is something that's really, I think, harmful. But also that there's this presumption that the body can be further and further instrumentalized in order to then lead to somehow well-being or health or whatever that is. And I think there's a kind of dangerous trajectory there about instrumentalization and viewing the human body or any kind of organic body as somehow being an object among objects.
Well, and this is where I think Fanon's training as a psychoanalyst really pays dividends for Fanon, because he's making the claim that if you want to think about the well-being of a colonized subject, of a Black subject, you cannot bracket the question of the psyche. Because that lived experience of a Black subject that is immersed in a system, in this case of French colonialism, the health of that subject will be compromised sometimes by purely objective anatomical, physiological conditions. But most of the time, you have to think about the whole patient as a person. And as soon as you bracket the psychological, the social, the psychic, you've already missed
Yeah.
the thing that you're supposed to be looking for.
Yeah.
And so the way
Yeah.
in which what medicine demands in the 19th century and afterwards, just a purely sort of anatomical, physiological account of illness, it already reflects a racial logic, because that will
Yeah.
not work for
Yeah.
the racialized subject who is a patient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it also reminds me, just in terms of, you put it very powerfully, when you tried your best to try to convince an authority that you need this thing, or that you are having this experience, and the inability of that other to sort of tune into the frequencies of your discourse,
Mhm.
just the kind of violence that is there. But at the same time, and this is something that, when thinking about the trans example that you mentioned, trans scholars have written about extensively, also the double-edged sword of actually being heard. Because of
Mhm.
course, in the case of trans health, to receive gender affirming treatment and procedures, there is this question about, well, to have access to that, I have to be diagnosed in a particular
Mhm.
way, and I have to be
Mhm.
medicalized, and my experience has to be biologized in a particular way that is dangerous. And yet,
Mhm.
if I don't do that, I don't have access to life affirming and life saving interventions. And it
Yeah.
just this really fragile, position that medicine as an institution places all kinds
Yeah.
of subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like one of the, if I was thinking of Foucauldians who have also shaped my thinking, I think Shelley Tremaine's work is really pivotal in that way too, is that she's also examining what she's, I don't know whether your previous speaker, Joel Michael Reynolds, mentioned or not, but like this kind of apparatus of disability, this kind of
Yes.
framing of disability as this broader, that includes a biomedical authority and control over embodiment and experience, but is not exclusive to it. And so I think that's like, I think in a way, Tremaine's work has been really important for me for thinking about, you know, how that type of authority and control and shaping of material access to resources is very much, I think, also like this creation of sets of embodied norms and sets of standards and sets of this kind of like very a quantified view of the body and a quantified
Yeah.
view of mental health and a quantified view of like, what well-being could even be. And so I think that that's also something that again is like, that's, if you're thinking about something like desire or pain, like those things are so
Right.
intimately connected to human experience that to do that is also to like also I think I think in a way it's a violence to try to require that human expression fulfill that type of
Right.
quantified trajectory. So I think that's Tremaine's work is really great in those senses because she's super attentive to that.
Great. And I mean, we're almost running out of time, so I just want to cover one last point here. And that is that, so we've talked about some of your work and you're thinking about carceral medicine, which I wanted to make sure we talked about.
Yeah.
But I actually want to go back a little bit to your dissertation work, because it all began by us thinking about interpellation, right? And the
Right.
force of language to make us do certain things, or to, by the very force of its manifestation, um, lead us to become a specific kind of
Mm-hmm.
subject, like a
Mm-hmm.
subject of law, in the case of the police person saying, hey, you.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that you were working with this framework in which we have third person interpellation, the they, and you gave
Mm-hmm.
the example of the school district in Tucson.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is a second order interpellation where you're addressing somebody else, and how that's shaped by all these power relations, which is what led us on this discussion about
Mm-hmm.
medicine and bioethics, and patient-doctor communication. But I want us to just return very quickly then to the last one, because we haven't
Yeah.
talked about it, which is that auto-interpellation or the first-person interpellation. And the reason that I want to make sure we cover it, of course, is because we haven't yet, but because my students are reading Foucault, who, especially in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1 all the way to 3, and the fourth one that just came out, I interpret him as writing about something that somebody could call auto-interpellation, the way in which I, as a subject, hold myself accountable to certain norms in a way that I determine appropriate. So there is this, what he calls subjectivation, the way in which I form myself through the narrative I tell myself about who I am. And this is where his concept of an aesthetics of experience comes in. But I don't want us necessarily to talk about Foucault. I actually want to hear about how you interpret first-person interpellation, which was the last level of your analysis.
I think it will fit to some degree well with what you're suggesting, but maybe we'll add, like, so my figure for that chapter was Gloria Anzaldúa. And I, in particular, I was looking at how she was writing about a term called autohistoria teoría, so like self-writing, self-telling theory. And so, which surfaces only a few places in her writings, and I think gets more pronounced in the 1990s. She dies in 2004, but she was working on a dissertation in the 90s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and she was taking courses in reading Althusser, and she was like, she actually has really interesting writings on self-representation. So she's also asking these questions about, like, what does it mean to put oneself into text, like to assume that one is now available and truthful about oneself in text. So she was playing with all of these, I think, really rich concepts and ideas about self-writing. And I think this actually connects me back to the work that I was doing in Latin American studies, because there's a kind of really cool set of cultural studies and literary studies authors and theories that are about how it is that someone writes oneself from a position of non-dominance. So, like, it may be that the authorial I can function in a certain way, like being able to say, like, I am so-and-so in a textual presentation that may function differently for people who are going to be believed when they say that, who are going to be viewed as authors of themselves, just in the way that you described it, right? So being like, yeah, I'm able to narrate myself. I have the authority to tell you who I am. I have the cultural capital to be able to do the exercise of self-description. And so what Anzaldúa and what folks like Sylvia Malloy or Doris Sommer were doing with, like, there's a book called Foundational Fictions, where she's looking at, like, how is it that, for example, like the great statesmen of Latin American political theory, so like Domingo Faustino Sarmiento in Argentina, Jose Vasconcelos in Mexico, like, how did these great statesmen even offer a narrative in the context in which they are now being viewed as politically, like at least for Vasconcelos, politically degenerate, right? Being viewed as living in a cultural context and a political context that is not progressive, is not civilizing, and not, living towards an era of the future. And so Summer writes about, like, what did it mean to be autobiographers and write from those positions of non-dominance? So Anzaldúa is also reading that. Like, we know Anzaldúa read Vasconcelos, and she's reading about Mexican history and philosophy. We also know that she was reading about self-representation in Latin American writing. So actually, if there's now, the archives on Anzaldúa have her full library, and they have it, I have the spreadsheet on my hard drive, and so, I'm often looking up, like, did she have that book, or would she have, But so I also know that she was reading about these foundational forms of autobiography in Latin American studies and Latin American literature and so on. And so by the time she starts writing about this description and self-authorship from non-dominance, she's also now thinking that this is not a solitary exercise. And I think that's a really important thing that I found in Anzaldúa, that I think her notion of autohistoria teoría is a way of saying that when I write about myself as from a position of non-dominance, it's because, or like one of the functions of that, one of the ways that it's transformative is that it creates language for others to be able to become part of. And so that like I may use myself as the I is the referent in that case, the indexical. It's actually also an offering to you. You know, it's an offering to you to say, can you find yourself in this I? And so it becomes this like collective and intersubjective activity, which, you know, you could say happens for all autobiographical works, but at least to the extent that there are a dearth of resources for non-dominant folks to find ourselves in literature, right? If we're always thirsty to find someone else that we can actually resonate with or you know identify with, that self-writing from a position of non-dominance, when done in this particular way, is an offering. You know, I think that's actually the way that I understood her as offering it. And it's material offering. So it's also that like the terms that we're going to use, like, are there actual ways that we will move our mouth and the sounds, going back to the Fanon point that you made, that like literally our bodies will make an offering for you to hear. Like your ear will turn towards me if I pronounce something correctly, or you will find an embodied way to connect that might be opening for you rather than less of an opportunity for you to identify with. So I think that was something that in that last chapter, it was about not just self-writing to the extent that I'm an author of that I'm trying to narrate my own experience, but that narrating my own experience is this intersubjective process. Yeah. So that was kind of the point.
And at least when I've taught Anzaldúa in the past, I've always gotten the sense that for her, writing is certainly this intersubjective process, but also a process of self-finding. So it's not as if I am already there at the beginning of writing, and then I, present myself as a gift to others, sort of invoking a metaphysics of objects, if it's already there, already formed. But in the course of writing, I find and lose myself continuously, and it's this process of back and forth, this dialectic, and I think this is what makes Anzaldúa so powerful as a writer. That, and just her the way that she just does not mince words about who her audience is, right? Like there will be English, there will be Spanish, there will be a mix, and I've always really appreciated that. It's such a refreshing voice, especially for somebody that I grew up in Mexico, and seeing that kind of writing for the first time with Anzaldúa was really, really powerful when I was an undergraduate and I was a women's studies major, which is where I ran into her work initially. When I've taught her now in San Francisco, she's always a major hit in the classes.
Yeah, same. I mean, I grew up in Florida, and so as in a bilingual household, and so like reading someone who is code switching and bilingual, and like, but also not in any like there's a very kind of localized set of dialects that she's also using. So like I know from both Spanish speakers and English speakers that they struggle with her work because of exactly how how playful she is, and also how contextually specific her writing is, language to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. So there's also that really exciting part of it, is that she's challenging her readers in all these ways, but also inviting them in these different ways. So I know I felt a similar way when I encountered her work, and also with the point that you just made about the point that you just made was, I just had something that I wanted to add to the point you just made about what her work was doing on language. That was really
on
helpful.
Finding and losing.
Finding and losing. Yes. So that she has this really interesting concept that she calls the Koyoshoki imperative. I don't know if you've read this in like Now Let Us Shift or any of her later writings, but basically it becomes this task of what she calls re-membering, so remembering. But it kind of plays with the idea that if you remember something, it's like already there. But what she means is like, no, what you're doing is perpetually like breaking apart and then reconstellating, and then breaking apart and then reorganizing. And so that the process of self-writing and self-transformation is that kind of rupture and reorganization, and rupture and reorganization. And so she has that kind of like Actually the book I just finished is on that. Is on Allah. It's on
Okay.
Anzaldúa. It's coming out I think next year. I mean it's already in production right now. It's called Nos Otras, and it's focusing on Anzaldúa explicitly and on what I'm calling multiplicitous agency in her writings. And so very much this idea of like how it is that that we are able to do the task of self-creation and self-narration through this kind of collective and reorganizing project is a big piece of that book.
Yeah, and that image of breaking down and putting back together brings to mind the famous image in Nietzsche of the child playing with making figures in the sand and sort of
Mm-hmm.
destroying them and just building new things, sort of this playfulness. And I do think there is there is this Nietzschean element of play and affirmation, except that of course it grows out of a different tradition,
Yeah.
and it's situated differently.
And there's
But
also good people who now who are doing crossover work between Anzaldúa and Nietzsche. So
oh,
like I
really?
mentioned
Great.
Ofelia Schutte. Yeah, Ofelia Schutte, when I was taking classes with her, her first book is on Nietzsche. So she's her primary figure, so to say, is Nietzsche. And so she has actually in a recent book that it just came out with myself, Mariana Ortega, and Jose Medina just published a collection on US Latinx and Latin American feminist philosophy. And Ofelia Schutte has an article in there on Nietzsche and Anzaldúa.
Okay.
So too does Natalie Cisneros. So if you haven't talked to Natalie Cisneros, who does great work
Okay.
on Latino feminism, immigration, and also Nietzsche and Foucault, and critical prison studies, Natalie Cisneros also has a piece in there on Anzaldúa and Nietzsche. So there's this kind of growing dialogue among Latina feminists on Nietzsche's relationship to Anzaldúa. So I think your hunch is
Okay.
right there that there's a lot going on there.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we're here out of time. Andrea, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I really like that we're ending on this theme that hasn't come up before, which is about the politics and the exercise of writing,
Mm-hmm.
and this kind of self-relation. And as a final reference to Foucault, I'm currently working through volume 2 of the history of sexuality with my students. And it reminds me of when Foucault wrote volume 1 of the history of sexuality, he had a plan of what the history of sexuality was going to look like. It was going to be a 6-volume thing with a specific structure. He finishes volume 1 and then he sort of reassesses and he says, I need to change gears after the first one was written. And in the beginning of the new volume 2, which was now part of a new project, he reflects on this question about changing oneself and being willing to abandon the
Mm.
self that one was in one's writings in the past. And he appeals to this to the French category of the essay, or the genre of the essay, in the
Mm-hmm.
tradition of Montaigne,
Mm-hmm.
and he says that's what philosophy is. It's essaying.
Yeah.
It's working through it and not ending in the same place that you thought you were going to end from the very beginning. And so I really like that, especially because in French, this notion of essaying has a double connotation between writing and also with experimenting, in which
Oh, interesting.
writing is an experimental practice of the self, where you write
Yeah.
yourself, but it wasn't there from the beginning. So I'm halfway through that volume 2, and so there seems to be a clear connection here.
That's
But
fantastic.
um,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for chatting with me, and I'm going to ask you to send me a couple of your articles so I can share them also with my students. So
Sure.
if that's okay with you. And again, thanks, and I
Yeah.
hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.